The chair was still pushed out from the table. Marin noticed it first, the way she noticed everything now, with the particular needle-sharp attention of someone who had learned that the world could subtract things without warning. Lena's chair, pushed out at that exact angle, the way she always left it, like she'd only stepped away for a moment and would be back before the food got cold. 3 weeks since the Vothura came. 3 weeks since they took her, and no one had touched that chair. Davin was standing at the window with his back to her. He'd been standing there for 20 minutes. She'd counted. The relay's dead, he said. Grid 7 through 11. Whatever they did to the substation last night, it worked. I know what it means, Davin. He turned then, and she saw how hollowed out he looked. The jawline she had once loved, sharp now in a different way, worn down to something almost skeletal. They hadn't been a couple in 4 years. They'd been Lena's parents, which was a different thing entirely, and in some ways a harder thing, requiring a more specific and demanding kind of negotiation. They'd gotten good at it, sitting across from each other at school performances, remembering to speak in civil tones, making sure she never once felt the weight of what had gone wrong between them. And now the thing that had held them in proximity was gone, and they were just two people in a kitchen, and the chair was still pushed out at that angle, and neither of them could bring themselves to fix it. There's a group, he said. Haverstrom's people, they're moving on the processing facility in the Delta sector tomorrow night. I heard. They want us. She turned from the chair. They want you. You're the one who worked in atmospheric systems. You're the one who knows how the intake vents are configured. They want both of us. He came away from the window, and she caught the slight hesitation in his movement, the old injury in his right knee, the one she'd watched him favor for a decade, the one he'd never quite admitted to. Celia ran an analysis on the extraction signatures, the ones from 3 weeks ago. She thinks she knows which facility they took them to, the ones they took from this sector. Marin was very still. She thinks Lena might be in there, he said. She thinks a lot of them might still be alive. The kitchen was quiet for a long time. Outside, through the dust-filmed window, the sky had that color it always had now. That bruised, amber-gray tint from the atmospheric processors. The Vothara had been running for 2 weeks without stop, drawing something out of the upper air that no one had yet been able to identify. The sun came through it dull and reddish and wrong, like a sun from someone else's planet. Tell me everything, Marin said. The Vothara had arrived in the way of things that have no interest in being dramatic about themselves. No single massive ship descending through clouds. No transmission in every language on Earth, no countdown, no ambassador. 17 objects, each approximately 400 meters in its longest dimension, had decelerated from an interstellar approach vector into low orbit over the course of 3 hours, and then they had simply stopped. Hung there. For 6 days they did nothing at all. Governments went through the standard frantic motions. Attempts at communication, emergency military posturing. The full theater of institutional response to something that had rendered institutions meaningless. The Vothara, as far as anyone could tell, did not notice. On the 7th day, they began the extractions. The process was unlike anything that science fiction had ever prepared humanity for. No beams of light, no paralytic rays, no traceable energy signatures that could be tracked or blocked or reversed engineered. People simply stopped being where they were, in the middle of sentences, mid-stride. A woman in Nairobi had been photographed at 11:47 a.m., mid-law, coffee cup raised. By 11:48 she was gone, and the cup was on the floor, and the coffee was spilling, and the laugh was still somehow in the air, documented forever on someone else's phone. 400 million people in the first 72 hours. Then the rate slowed, became selective. Pattern-seeking analysts eventually concluded, with the particular grim creativity of people trying to find meaning in catastrophe, that the Vothara were taking people between the ages of 8 and 26. They were taking the young, no one knew why. Theories proliferated with the desperate energy of minds that cannot accept an absence of explanation. Biological harvesting, labor exploitation, some kind of incomprehensible cultural practice. The Vothara themselves offered no clarification. They were not interested in explaining themselves to the species they were methodically dismantling. Lena had been 14. Haverstrom's base was a decommissioned water treatment facility on the city's eastern edge, chosen for its underground chambers and its distance from the amber haze of the atmospheric processors. 31 people were gathered in what had once been a filtration room, the curved concrete walls hung with maps and signal intercepts and photographs. Marin and Davon arrived separately, as they always did, and stood on opposite sides of the room, as they always did, and refused to acknowledge that this was a habit rather than a coincidence. Celia was a small woman of about 60, with the focused, low-temperature intensity of someone who had spent decades doing work that required precision, and had never been able to explain to her friends why she cared so much about it. She'd been a xenolinguistics researcher before the arrival, one of 20 people on Earth specifically trained for this exact scenario, and the only one still working. She pulled up the analysis on a battered tablet and walked them through it without ceremony. The extraction signatures have a consistent directionality, she said. They're not storing the extracted individuals in the orbital vessels. The signatures attenuate downward, not upward. They're using a relay, a surface-level processing station that holds biological material temporarily before it's transferred. She moved to a photograph on the wall, satellite imagery, partially obscured by atmospheric distortion but legible enough. A large structure on the Delta Flatlands, surrounded by what appeared to be an exclusion field. This facility became active approximately 48 hours before the first extractions in this sector. The timing is not coincidental. You said biological material, someone said from across the room, an older man, voice flat. You mean people? Yes, Celia said without flinching. I mean people. And if the transfer cycle matches the pattern we've observed in other regions, the people currently held in that facility will be transferred upward to the orbital vessels in approximately 60 hours. The room was very quiet. After transfer, she continued, we lose the signal entirely. We don't know what happens after that. We have no data on the orbital interiors. Marin was watching Davin across the room. His face was doing the thing it did when he was making a calculation. That slight tightening around the eyes, the jaw set fractionally forward. She knew that face. She'd watched it across dinner tables and in hospital waiting rooms, and in the terrible fluorescent light of a courtroom 7 years ago when they'd been making different calculations about what to lose and what to keep. She had never entirely stopped being able to read him, which was one of the things that had made the divorce so awful. You couldn't perform indifference to someone who had learned the grammar of your face. The intake vents, he said. You need someone who knows the atmospheric exchange systems. Celia looked at him. Yes. Because the exclusion field doesn't extend to the subterranean intake infrastructure. It was designed to keep out conventional intrusion. A small enough team, moving through the primary and secondary vent shafts, could reach the interior without triggering the field's detection threshold. Celia finished. That's the theory. How long has it been a theory? Since I found the facility's construction signatures. The Vathara built it using prefabricated modular systems. Those systems were designed for a different atmosphere, much lower in nitrogen. They didn't account for what an Earth-standard atmospheric processing setup would require. She paused. They didn't account for a lot of things about us. The briefing ran for 3 hours. Davin led most of it, sketching ventilation system schematics from memory on a whiteboard, cross-referencing them with what Celia's satellite analysis could confirm. Marin watched him work. He was good at this. Had always been good at this. The spatial reasoning, the infrastructure thinking, the ability to hold complex three-dimensional systems in his head and rotate them and find the failure points. It was part of what she had loved about him first, that mind. The problem was that you couldn't love a mind in isolation. The mind came with a person, and the person had their own architecture, their own blind spots and stress fractures, and eventually you discovered that the thing you'd fallen for was also the thing that made it impossible. She caught him looking at her twice during the briefing. Both times he looked away before she did. Afterward, when most of the others had left or retreated to their corners of the facility, she found him in one of the side chambers, sitting on an upturned crate, eating something from a can with the mechanical focus of someone fueling a machine rather than feeding a hunger. You think she's in there, Marin said. He didn't pretend to misunderstand. The extraction point was 2 blocks from the school. The timing puts her in the initial sweep. He stared at the can. Statistically, if any of them from this sector are being held locally, she'd be among them. Statistically, I don't have better than statistics right now. She sat down on a second crate, across from him. The space between them was about 4 feet. In the last 4 years, 4 feet had been the minimum safe operating distance. She'd never analyzed it before, but she recognized it now. You should have called me, she said. When Celia first told you, you should have called me that night. I know. I had to hear it from Brecken. I know, Marin. I'm sorry, she looked at the floor. That's not enough. It's what I have. Outside, Somewhere in the amber-tinted dark, something moved through the sky. One of the Vothara vessels performing its slow, indifferent transit from one sector to the next. The sound it made was not a sound exactly, more a pressure change, a tightening of the air. They both felt it and neither of them said anything about it. She kept a recording, Marin said. On her phone. You probably don't know about it. She recorded herself sometimes when she couldn't sleep, just talking, whatever was in her head. She'd been doing it for about a year. She paused. I found one of them last week. She was talking about that argument you and I had at her recital in February. She wasn't angry about it. She was analyzing it. She was trying to understand how two people who obviously still cared about each other could be so bad at being in the same room. A sound that was not quite a laugh. She was 14. She was more perceptive than either of us has ever managed to be. Van set the can down. She said she thought we were both afraid of the same thing, Marin continued. That we each thought the other one had stopped trying first. And that if we could just, she used this phrase. She said if we could just agree on when it started breaking, then we could stop defending the break and start talking about whether it was fixable. She looked up at him. 14 years old. His face was doing something complicated that she didn't have a name for. When did she? 2 weeks before the arrival. She let that sit for a moment. She was going to talk to us about it, I think. I think she was working up to it. He was quiet for a long time. The pressure change came again, that heavy atmospheric slide, and both of them breathed through it. It wasn't fixable, he said finally, was it? I don't know. Maybe it was. Maybe we just decided it wasn't and then proved ourselves right. She stood up. I think we should sleep. Tomorrow's going to be hard. Marin, she stopped. I should have called you, he said. The moment Celia told me, I should have called you before I even fully understood what she was saying. That was a failure and I'm not going to say it wasn't. She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded once and walked back toward the sleeping area and didn't let herself think about the chair pushed out at that angle. Because if she started thinking about it, she would not be able to stop, and she needed to sleep, and tomorrow was going to be hard. They went in at 3 in the morning. 8 people total, moving in 2 teams through the secondary vent shafts that Davin had mapped. The shafts were tight, designed for atmospheric exchange, not human ingress, and they moved on their elbows and knees through the dark. The only sound, the scrape of fabric against metal, and the distant rhythmic thrum of whatever the Vothara's processors were doing to the air above them. Marin was directly behind Davin. She could feel the heat of him in the confined space. The Vothara's presence in the facility was different from what the briefings had suggested. They were there, certainly. 3 of them, stationed at different points in the interior, performing functions that were not immediately legible, but they were not vigilant in the way that a guarding species would be vigilant. They moved through the facility spaces with the contained, purposeful motion of technicians attending to equipment, present and alert to their task, but not watching for intrusion. They had secured the obvious entry points. They had not secured themselves against a species that knew how ventilation systems worked. This was the thing about the Vothara that Celia had been trying to explain to people since the beginning. Though most people were too frightened or too angry to hear it clearly, they were extraordinarily advanced. Their technology represented a gap measured not in decades but in what might be centuries. Their biological sciences were sophisticated beyond current human modeling. Their propulsion systems, their material science, their communications architecture, all of it was simply, comprehensively beyond. But they had encountered nothing like humans before, not in the specific sense that they hadn't encountered intelligent life. Celia believed, from the fragmentary linguistic analysis she'd managed, that they had encountered dozens of intelligent species. What they hadn't encountered was the particular combination of biological stubbornness and infrastructural obsessiveness that defined Homo sapiens, a species that had spent 10,000 years building increasingly complex systems to manage the flow of air and water and energy through human settlements, a species that had developed, in other words, an intimate and detailed knowledge of the insides of things. The Vothara had built their processing facility. They had not considered who might know how the walls breathed. The holding area was in the facility's central chamber. Marin saw it from above first, through a ventilation grate in the ceiling, and then she stopped breathing, because the scale of it was wrong in a way she hadn't prepared for. Not the size of the chamber, though it was enormous, high-ceilinged, and lit in the Vothara's characteristic blue-white light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. It was the number. They'd estimated dozens. There were hundreds. Human beings, all of them young, all of them apparently conscious and unharmed, contained within what appeared to be individual stasis fields. Each person standing or sitting or lying within a zone of slightly altered light, aware but unable to move. Expressions ranging from blank to terrified to something like the exhausted calm of people who had been frightened for too long and were running out of the energy for it. She scanned. She scanned again. The grate was small and the chamber was vast and the lighting was wrong and she was working at an angle and there, third row from the left, seventh position. A girl with her dark hair loose around her shoulders, unusual enough to catch the eye, because most of the others had their hair tied back or cropped, and this girl's was long and unbound. Sitting with her knees pulled to her chest, head resting on her arms, and even at this distance, even through a ventilation grate, in a hostile alien facility in the third week of the end of the world, Marin knew her daughter's posture the way she knew her own heartbeat. She pressed her hand over her mouth. Devon was beside her. He had gone absolutely still. A long moment passed. Below them, the Vothara technicians moved through their incomprehensible tasks. The blue-white light was constant and cold. Then Davin's hand found hers in the dark. It was not a romantic gesture. It was not a reconciliation. It was the specific, unornamented contact of one human being reaching for another in a moment too large for anything more complicated. And Marin held on to it like something structural, like a load-bearing wall she had not known she needed until the floor dropped away. They lay there for 1 full minute, not moving, memorizing the geography of the chamber. Then they pulled back and rejoined their team and the work began. The stasis fields were electromagnetic in nature. Celia had theorized as much from the extraction signatures. And up close the faint harmonic resonance confirmed it. The fields were maintained by relay nodes distributed through the chamber. Disabling the relay nodes would release everyone simultaneously. The problem was the 3 Vothara technicians. The Vothara were large. Not grotesquely so, not in the alien monster sense, but large in the practical sense. 2.5 meters, dense, and built along a musculature that suggested their homeworld gravity ran higher than Earth's. Their visual spectrum included infrared. Their hearing operated in a frequency range that human footsteps did not particularly trouble. Their smell, Davin said quietly, in the ventilation shaft outside the secondary access point. Celia's notes said their olfactory sense is weak. Relatively weak, Marin said. Relative to their other senses. It's what we have. It was what they had. What followed in the next 37 minutes was not the stuff of epic storytelling. There was no elegantly choreographed sequence of takedowns, no perfectly timed diversions, no master plan executed with military precision. What there was instead was the messy, iterative, constantly revised problem-solving of people who were frightened and determined and working with imperfect information and no margin for failure. Haverstrom's team had repurposed industrial electrical equipment into disruption tools that had spent 3 weeks calibrating to the Vothara's electromagnetic bandwidth. They worked, mostly. One of them cut out at the worst possible moment and had to be restarted with hands that were shaking. One of the Vothara technicians turned in a direction that hadn't been anticipated, and a man named Taurus spent 4.5 minutes pressed against a wall, not breathing while it moved past him. The relay nodes went down one by one. Davin did the final 3 himself, moving through the chamber with a focused efficiency that Marin recognized from the briefing. That same tightening around the eyes, the jaw forward, the mind working the 3-dimensional problem and finding the path through it. She was watching his back, and watching the Vothara and watching the door and watching the held people begin to stir as their stasis fields dissolved. And somewhere in all of that watching, she caught the exact moment when the last node went down and a girl with loose dark hair lifted her head and looked at the ceiling with an expression of total bewilderment, and then, slowly began to stand. Marin crossed the distance to her in 7 seconds. She knew this because later she would remember nothing about crossing it. Only Lena's face when she saw her, the particular shape of her daughter's confusion, becoming recognition, becoming something that didn't have a name. She held her. She held her and didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say that would not collapse under its own weight, nothing that would not immediately become inadequate. And so she just held on. Davin arrived 30 seconds later. He came to a stop, and Lena looked at him over Marin's shoulder, and then Lena reached out and grabbed his sleeve and pulled him in. And for a moment, all three of them were just holding each other in the blue-white light of the alien facility, while around them hundreds of other people were doing their own version of the same unrepeatable thing. And none of it was graceful, and all of it was human. Getting out was harder than getting in. The Vothara technicians were alerted by the stasis field collapse, not by any alarm, not by any detection system that the team had triggered, but simply by the absence of the harmonic resonance that the fields had been producing. One of them began moving toward the primary access door. Torres, operating on pure instinct and an adrenaline override that he would later not entirely be able to explain, disabled it with a repurposed arc welder modified to output in the Vothara electromagnetic bandwidth. And the creature went down with a sound collapsing pressure and did not get up. He stood over it for a moment with his hands shaking. He was a high school science teacher. He had never hurt anything larger than a moth. The other two Vothera were in different sections of the facility. The team moved fast. Faster than the planning had accounted for, because the planning had assumed a much smaller number of held people. And the reality was 417 souls, all needing to move through secondary vent access points and service corridors in the dark. Many of them were disoriented. Some had been in stasis for weeks and their legs weren't cooperating. Older children were helping younger ones, and teenagers were supporting adults. And there were reunions happening in the worst possible locations at the worst possible moments. People stopping mid-corridor to grab each other, to confirm each other's realness, to make the animal-level check that yes, you are here, you are breathing, you are warm. Marin and Davan ran them through. She took the lead group through the primary extraction corridor. He ran the secondary route with the last third of the group. Kids who couldn't manage the vent shafts and needed the long way around. Riskier but traversable. They divided it without discussion, in the way that people who have co-parented for a decade sometimes divide things without discussion. Not because they are harmonious, but because they know each other's operational strengths without needing to articulate them. She was faster. He was better at keeping panicking people calm. The second Vothera intercepted his group in the Eastern Service Corridor. She heard about it later, from two different people who'd been there. The creature was between them and the exit, and it wasn't moving, and there was no room to go around. And Davan, according to both accounts, did not attempt a physical confrontation. Instead, he did something that had no precedent in any engagement protocol that Haverstrom's team had developed. Something that was either an act of genius or an act of desperation that happened to work, which is sometimes the same thing. He talked to it. He stood in that corridor with 400 feet of air between them and began talking to it in calm, clear sentences, maintaining eye contact, keeping his posture open, doing the specific behavioral display that human beings use to signal non-aggression to other human beings. It probably meant nothing to the Vothara. Its meaning was almost certainly lost in translation. But the behavior bought time. The 3 or 4 seconds of hesitation from the creature, which had evidently not encountered this specific response before, which had perhaps processed humans only as objects to be extracted and held, and had not had occasion to process them as things that stood still and made sustained eye contact and spoke in a measured way about the situation. In those 3 or 4 seconds, Torres came up behind it. The rest of the group cleared the corridor. The last Vothara was apparently not incapacitated. They heard it behind them, moving and moved faster, and the exit was suddenly there, and then the amber-gray night was around them. Vast and wrong-colored and cold, and they were running. Celia would later say that it was the largest single successful extraction from a Vothara processing facility in any sector that they had data on. She said this without triumph. It was not her nature to be triumphant, but with the focused interest of someone who understood that data was the real weapon, and that they had just acquired a great deal of it. The Vothara, as far as anyone could determine, did not retaliate. This was the strangest part. In the weeks that followed, analysts attempted to construct a model of why. The simplest explanation, and the one that Celia considered most likely, was that retaliation wasn't the point. The Vothara were not at war with humanity. They were processing it. Resistance of the kind they'd just experienced had probably not registered within their operational framework. They would recalibrate. They would adapt their methods. The next facility would be harder. The conflict was far from over, and no one should mistake a single successful action for a turning of any tide. But the 417 people who had been held in that facility went home that night, or went to wherever they were going, whatever those words meant now. for people whose homes had been standing for 3 weeks without them. They scattered into the amber dark in ones and twos and groups, back to whatever remained of their lives, carrying whatever they were carrying. Marin and Davon and Lena walked back together. The journey took most of the night. The transit infrastructure was down in this sector, and the vehicle fuel situation was what it was. And they were all three running on the wrong side of their reserves, so they walked. Lena was in the middle. She held her mother's hand for about 4 blocks, and then switched to her father's, and then eventually walked between them without holding either, which Marin recognized as its own kind of trust. The trust of a person who knows she doesn't need to hold on, because they'll both be there. Lena asked questions the way she always asked questions. Thorough, unsentimental, genuinely interested in the answers. She wanted to know how the vent access worked. She wanted to know what the stasis fields felt like from the outside, since from the inside they just felt like nothing. A gap in experience. A before and after with no during. She wanted to know what Celia's analysis of the Vathara linguistic structure had turned up. She thinks they have something like an aesthetic sense, Marin said. Based on the transmission patterns. The way they encode information has these recurring non-functional elements, structures that don't carry data but appear in consistent positions, like ornamentation. They make art, Lena said. Celia's careful about that interpretation. But that's what she means. Devon made a sound that might have been agreement. That's interesting, Lena said, and she meant it. The specific, focused interest of someone filing information for later use, for later thinking, which was a habit so characteristic of her that Marin felt something loosen in her chest just hearing it. That habit, that particular quality of attention, 3 weeks of not hearing it. Dawn came up through the amber haze, reddish and wrong and undeniable. The streets were quiet, the way they were quiet now. Not empty, people were up and moving. The human metabolism of cities was still running on its ancient rhythm. You could see lights in windows and figures in doorways, but subdued, careful. The particular quiet of a population that has learned to be aware of the sky. They reached the apartment building, walked up the stairs, the door. The kitchen was exactly as it had been. The food that had been on the counter 3 weeks ago had long since been cleared by Marin, but the table was the same table. The window still dust-filmed, the amber-gray light coming through it in that wrong-colored way. And the chair. Lena stopped when she saw it. She stood in the doorway looking at the chair for a long moment, at the exact angle of it, the specific distance from the table. Then she crossed the kitchen and sat down in it. That particular slow, deliberate sit of someone taking possession of a thing that belongs to them, pulling it in to the table's edge, with the specific scrape that it always made on those tiles. The sound that had been living in Marin's auditory memory for 22 days. Okay, Lena said. Just that. The word landing like a breath after a long-held pause. Marin stood in the kitchen doorway. Devon was behind her, and she was aware of him as a physical fact in the space, a presence rather than a distance for the first time in a long time. She was aware that there were conversations still ahead of them. Difficult ones, practical ones. The vast, unresolved logistics of a world mid-catastrophe and a family mid-something else entirely. She was aware that 417 people had made it out tonight, and that however many millions were still gone, still held, still somewhere in those orbital vessels above the amber-tinted sky. She was aware of everything that was unfinished. But Lena had sat down in her chair, and the chair had made its sound against the tiles. She let herself have 30 seconds with just that, the sound. The fact of her daughter's weight in that chair, real and present and breathing, pulling herself into the table in the specific way she always had. The gesture unchanged by anything that had happened, by any of the weeks-long horror of it, as if the body remembered home even when home had stopped making sense. 30 seconds. Then she moved into the kitchen and started making coffee with what was left of the reserves. And Devon came in after her and sat down in his old place. Not his old place, the one from before the divorce, but his Lena's drop-off pickup place. The chair he'd been sitting in for 4 years of co-parenting logistics. And the three of them sat around the table as the dawn light grew wrong-colored through the window. And they talked. Not about everything, not yet, but about enough. About Celia's plans for the data they'd gathered. About what Haverstrom's people were already calling the template. The ventilation access method. The documentation of it. The distribution to other sectors. About Lena's account of the stasis. The before and after with no during. And what she thought it might mean about how the Vothara processed time. About a girl in the stasis field next to hers who had apparently found a way to communicate through the field's boundary in a hand signal language she'd invented on the spot. She's probably 12, Lena said. But she had the whole thing worked out. A system for who was okay and who wasn't. How long they'd been there, how many exits she'd counted. She'd been making notes in her head for weeks. A pause. We need to find her. She made it out, Davin said. I saw her in the corridor. Small kid, red jacket. We need to find her, Lena said again, in the tone that meant this was not a negotiable item. A tone she had inherited in equal measure from both of them, which had always been one of those things that made Marin feel complicated and proud simultaneously. Outside, the sky was doing what it did now. The Vothara vessels tracked their slow, indifferent transits. The atmospheric processors ran their unknowable cycle. The world was still broken in all the ways it had been broken last night, and would be broken tomorrow. And the conflict was vast, and the odds were not good, and the work ahead was enormous. In the kitchen, the coffee was almost ready. All right, Marin said, we find her. And she meant that specifically. The girl in the red jacket, the one who had invented a language in the dark, and used it to take inventory of her own captivity, who had understood at 12 years old that information was the thing worth preserving. But she also meant it less specifically. She meant the other 416. She meant whoever was in the next facility. And the one after that. And the long, slow, stubborn process of figuring out what the Vathara hadn't anticipated about a species that had spent 10,000 years learning the insides of things. She meant all of it. Davin's hand was on the table, and it was not near hers. There were 4 feet of table between them, roughly, but it was there, and it was not pointing away. And she thought about a 14-year-old girl recording herself in the dark, working carefully through the question of when breaking started, and whether starting was the same as being unfixable. She poured the coffee. The chair was no longer pushed out at that angle. It was pulled in, the way it was supposed to be, the way it would be as long as Lena was in the room to pull it in. That was enough for now. More than enough. More than the world had given them any right to expect. They drank the coffee, and they made their plans, and outside the amber light was slowly, barely, tentatively beginning to look like morning.